Welcome again to Bergson, ongoing series in the holographic theory of mind. This will be part 21, refuting the external world, or rather, not refuting the external world. And so we'll be dealing with Goran Backlund and his rather interestingly received book, Refuting the External World, Bernardo Kastrup, his book More Than Allegory, and thus with the whole notion that objective reality doesn't exist, or that equivalently all is idea, or idealism over alles, as it seems idealism in these people's minds should indeed reign. And so part and parcel of this will be what I'll call quantum frustration syndrome, attempting to derive, therefore, the implications from the strange findings of quantum mechanics, and a good deal of hard problem anxiety, where the hard problem floats over all and it's apparently unresolved. The situation as we've seen. So the problem is a rather common position out there, namely, the external world is an illusion. This correlated variance. The external world is simply generated by our individual consciousness. Or another version, the external world is generated by consciousness in general, that is, universal consciousness or cosmic being. And finally, there is no objective world out there, period. Now, the position itself seems a little too strange to be seriously considering in some ways. All one has to do is think about the bad things that the outer world can do to us. We can get hit in the head by a golf ball. We can get smashed by a falling piano from 10 stories up. We can be attacked by beavers. And then you get to the rather stretched psychological mechanisms. One would have to invoke, one thing, subconscious, whereby we would do this to ourselves. And of course, you're dealing with the problem that you have collectives of people, for example, hundreds of people that all experience sinking on the Titanic, experience wars, etc., etc. And so you've got a rather daunting task of explaining how an objective world doesn't exist when all these subjective minds seem to be experiencing the same thing simultaneously, furthermore, experiencing bad things. And so one can get an intuition quickly that there's a gigantic pile of mechanics and explanations that has to be invoked to really explain all this if you're going in this it's all idea, all just consciousness direction. So despite the many difficulties such theories face, nevertheless they have momentum. And one can ask why. Why the current effort? Well, in my opinion, it's because the hard problem, for one thing, has seemed so absolutely recalcitrant. Or equivalently, that there is no theory of the origin of the image of the external world in the first place. So we really don't understand where our consciousness, even of the coffee cup and stirring spoon, comes from. And equivalently, this is to say that Bergson, who has such a theory, has been completely buried by the philosophy world. And totally not helping, there's the great prevalence of indirect realism, particularly in AI, cognitive science, most of philosophy, where the physical world is held to be quite real. The coffee cup is out there, the spoon is out there, the table is out there, the stirring is real, but the image of that coffee cup is only in the brain, or somehow generated by the brain, but is not actually the external world. And of course, this position of indirect realism opens the way to the question, is the cup really there in the first place? Because if it's just an image in the brain, then you're back to the standard idealist question instantly. Well, how do we know that that cup is really out there? So, all in all, this is a very unsatisfying state of affairs. And so, if we put an idealist group on the psychologist or psychiatrist couch, we tend to think that there's some, well, deep reaction going on to this whole situation. So we'll take a look at a couple of efforts to escape this rather sad state of affairs. So first we're going to look at Goran Backlund and his book, Refuting the External World. Now, Refuting is a very short book. It's only 43 pages. It's only available on Kindle at $9.99, which is rather an incredible price for a tiny Kindle book. 43 pages. Anyhow, it's got 77 reviews, 85% of which are 4 to 5 stars. So a good number of people see the book as having substance and being of interest. Now, Goran begins with this kind of statement. All is simply images. All of this. Look around the room, he gestures. It's just visual sensations. Now, this sounds like Bergson in actuality, where Bergson says the universe is an aggregate of images, just an aggregate of images. But the difference we'll see is going to be profound. So Goran continues. The best those scientists can do is examine these images in a vain attempt at guessing what's on the other side of them. It's as if we're living in this private virtual depiction of a world from which we're forever shut out. Again, remember the last slide with the coffee cup inside the brain. A virtual depiction of the world from which we are forever shut out. Now, Goran goes on, the question is experience just a simulation, just generated? He says, you call it a brain, but there's nothing suggesting that this sensorial apparatus of ours couldn't be a computer generating experiential content, that is the coffee cup, in a sophisticated simulation. My point being that whatever is giving rise to our experience is in itself a part of it, any more than a video camera is found in the film it produces. And so, investigating the images says nothing about the kind of device that produces them, in what reality such a device exists, or if there even is an objective reality behind them, the real kicker. And so the kicker, no objective reality. He goes on, maybe there's something, or maybe there's nothing but this field of experiencing. As long as we maintain the idea of an objective reality, a so-called apparatus for experiencing must necessarily exist in order to account for our subjective experience of that reality. So we should stop here already. The rest of the book is devoted to arguments justifying this position, and we'll look at some of these. But the position itself is already, to me, a form of desperation, or better, just a lack of a solution to the origin of the image of the external world. As already noted, Bergson himself referred to the world as the aggregate of images. All is an image, he noted. An atom is an image. A neuron is an image. A brain is an image. In other words, we have nothing that we refer to in this world that's not some form of image. But this image mode is just one mode of referring to the universal field. The other mode is the holographic mode. And in this mode, every point in the field reflects the state of all of the points. It's a massive interference pattern, as we noted. It's a holographic field. And this type of field, this holographic universal field, is non-imageable. So all images have to be derived. Or, as I'm saying in the slide, images are derived from this holographic field. So an image is necessarily but a part of a limitation on this whole non-imageable field. The image mode is the only mode our knowledge can assume, our discourse can assume. And I'm noting here, if you see number 12, part 12 on Sartre, and Sartre's fail on Bergson, I think one sees my best discussion so far on these two modes and how badly one can miss on what Bergson is actually talking about without grasping this distinction. So images are derived. Now we know Bergson had a mechanism for this, and that is that the brain serves as a modulated reconstructive wave. It's passing through this holographic field, picking out information relative to the body's action out of the vast information in the holographic field. And this brain-supported wave is thus specific to a subset of the field, and by this process now being an image of the field. The coffee cup and the wispy steam rising that SpongeBob is staring at. But this perception is direct. We see things right where they are within the external field. SpongeBob sees the coffee cup exactly where it is in space, external to him on the table, and he's seeing this directly. It's a direct perception. Point is, there's a mechanism to derive images from this field, an optically based mechanism. But this holographic field, however, is objective. It is real. It is out there. But the brain, as a reconstructive wave, again, we know that it's performing an optimal specification or a probabilistic specification. Why? Well, due to the aperture problem, where the eyes can only then pick up partial information relative to velocities. So velocities are uncertain. Remember, the rotating cube there is actually a partitioned set of velocity flows, each side being a velocity flow, the edges, the vertices being sharp discontinuities at these flows. And then, secondly, due to the indivisible flow of time itself. That is, time as a continuous, truly continuous flux, meaning that no determinate quantity can be fixed. No matter how small the interval we examine, there is continuous change, therefore inherently uncertainty. And the brain, number 3, is embedded in this transforming field. It is an integral part of this field. It knows nothing about computation with respect to fixed values. It can only do its best to isolate optimally invariance. And as we saw, sometimes this optimal specification, given the right conditions, we can go from an optimally specified rigid rotating cube to a optimally specified wobbly plastic, not a cube, where the edges and vertices are lost. The so-called static features are gone in the specification. And I noted even normal reconstructive waving, or the reconstructive wave process in holography, is, in a sense, optimal. I can store the wavefront of the cube on the holographic plate using frequency 1 as the reference wave, or I can store the wavefront from the cup on the same plate in the same holographic field, in other words, using frequency 2 as the reference wave. And if I modulate with a less than coherent reconstructive wave that's a composite of frequency 1 and frequency 2, I'll get a composite fuzzy image. Now, that would be, on one version, a non-veridical specification, because we know there's a cube in there or a coffee cup in there in that holographic field or that holographic plate that could be specified optimally, veridically, but the information that was given, the specification was optimal, cube plus cup. So while a direct realism, what Bergson was really describing is not a naive realism. It's not a simple specification of just what's there. But Goran could only conceive of a naive realism. To quote, if we were to assume that our apprehension of things is unmediated, which is to say, my little brackets there mean my words, direct. So if we assume the apprehension of things, the reception of things, in other words, is direct, that is to say that we are seeing them just as they are, we would have to concede that the actual world is really made out of the colors that we see and the sound that we hear. We would have to believe that objects in fact grow larger as we approach them, and the dinner plate seen from an angle becomes elliptical. So now, yes, in this quote he's saying just as they are, not where they are, that is within the external field, but it's quite clear, given he doubts the objective world at all, that he would equally have a problem with where they are, let alone how they are. But the just as they are is similarly a lack of consideration of the nature of the brain's specification of the external field as an optimal specification based on inherent uncertainty. It was stated that the brain is a modulated reconstructive wave now, and that is modulated by the invariant structure of events. So this modulating via the invariant structure of events is going to come back in here quickly. Goran says, we would have to believe that objects in fact grow larger as we approach them, as we saw, and a dinner plate would, seen from an angle, becomes elliptical. But the cup is growing, as we see, but it is simultaneously, it is being specified as a constant height. Why? Because as the cup moves across the texture gradient on the table, there is a ratio preserved, as we saw. The height, S, grows proportionally as the number N of texture rows occluded decreases. Or we have this little invariance law, S is proportional to 1 over N. So as we move the cup across the table, across the texture density gradient rows, the height of the cup doubles, but the number of rows occluded is halved, from 4 rows being occluded in the back to 2 rows occluded in the frontal position. An invariance law. And we've discussed a number of such invariance laws in part 2. So what we have here is rather a complete refusal to consider the actual structure in the field that colors, shall we say, that we'll come back to that Goran is talking about. So we return to this all is color statement, but we already see a problem, and that is massive structure in the ecological world is being ignored that is quite independent of color. So to continue on specification, we also saw in earlier parts that due to the brain's chemical dynamics, the specification is at a scale of time. We've got swiftly turning cubes versus very slowly turning cubes, buzzing flies versus heron-like flies, roses exploding in growth versus very slowly opening roses. So increasing the energy state of the brain decreases the scale of time. It decreases the scale of time imposed upon the external field. Again, we go from a buzzing fly to a very slow moving heron-like fly. We're decreasing the scale of time. So, but Backlund argues that we can't even know if a brain exists. Quote, maybe there's nothing but this field of experiencing, as long as we maintain the idea of an objective reality. A so-called apparatus for experiencing, that is a brain, must necessarily exist in order to account for our subjective experience of that reality. So we're all flies suddenly to become heron-like. Backlund must say that this is just an ordinary, arbitrary decision of mind in general, or the field of experience, which he equivalences to mind, having nothing to do with the brain. So none of the time scaling that we talked about, he could even regard necessarily as a function of the brain at all. So this is resonances to what I've termed in other parts the time scale fallacy, where the universe is taken to look like our normal world of buzzing flies or tables or slowly swirling coffee, despite discussion of particles that you'll see occasionally in Refuting the External World underlying everything. Recall the Spacetime Block discussion given in part 8b, where consciousness fields, sort of like a camera, were postulated to be running along world lines in the block. So we've got our space-time block on top there, and then, but if we look inside the block, we see on the right, we see these world lines on a two-dimensional projection, which would be events on a two-dimensional plane. And we have a one-dimensional observer in this case, moving along like a camera along the tracks. And that camera would be registering things like buzzing flies or chickens or golf balls. But the question was, why chickens? Why buzzing flies? Why not just ensembles of electrons or quarks? Why, in other words, would the camera be picking up this scale? If you remember, this was partly John Smythe's model, a camera literally running along tracks in the brain. Same problem, whether it's tracks in the brain or tracks in the world, you have the same scale problem. But Backlund's field of experience just happens to be conveniently at our normal scale. Remember the little girl looking at the room. Apparently, given there are no constraints on mind, this experience field could all change quite arbitrarily. And that room that little girl was looking at could be rather remarkably different. But based on what? An arbitrary change in quote-unquote mind. So continuing on specification for a second, we know that the specification is to the past. That is to a past portion of the indivisible transformation of the matter field, and that there are no instants in this flow. So then what we said is there's no need of a memory, whether it be an iconic store, quote unquote, or short-term memory or intermediate-term memory, to preserve these instants from loss. That is, from going into non-existence, which is symbolized by the term past. So we notice our little fly moves from point to point on its trajectory, simultaneously each point being an instant. As each instant passes, that goes into the past. And so each of those instants, to register that motion, have to be stored in some sort of storage area in the brain and then reconstructed, because in the very metaphysic in which brain storage works, it's only the brain that's present that must be given the responsibility of preserving the past from non-existence, from destruction. But for folks like Goran, this brings us to the most confounding, or shall we say unexpected aspect of Bergson. And that's the union and distinction of subject and object in terms of not of space, but of time. So in terms of not of space, but of time, we saw there's no true spatial distinction between our body and the matter field, or our body and the fly. Furthermore, the field has the attributes of mind and elementary awareness, as each point reflects, influences every other point, the holographic property of the field, and then a primary or elementary memory via the indivisible or non-differentiable transformation of the field. So the field, taken at the null scale of time, the most infinitely small imaginable scale, is, per Bergson, pure perception. And in this framework, solving the hard problem, which is the origin of the image of the external world, is defining how perception is limited, how pure perception, which is this holographic level perception, is limited such that it becomes the image of the fly, a part of that field. This says, however, that the matter field, as I like to call it, is a psychophysical field in that, in effect, all is mind. But all is mind is exactly what Goran wants. Again, discussing that field of experience, quote unquote, says Walt, who's in the book is Goran's sometimes rather patsy interlocutor. Walt says, so what is all this, pointing around to the surrounding room, etc., the world, the room. And says Goran, and this is the very last rather dramatic sentence of Refuting, has been called many names, but I think that Tao is the oldest. But Bergson is both Taoist and Zen. A koan, mu, or what is the sound of one hand clapping, or who is it that hears, ultimately shatters the distinction between subject and object, or the structure of self as a distinct object surrounded by other objects in space. So yes, yet in Bergson, the external world is entirely objective, out there. One can be hit by golf balls or pianos, and yet we don't have to explain how mind creates this, or how multiple people witness it or experience it together. Again, this entire set of mechanisms, why would one would do this to oneself, and how it's all experienced together by multiple minds is a subject actually scarcely bothered with in Refuting. In other words, all the machinery necessary for idealism is seldom gone into. And as opposed to Goran, where all is just idea, we are actually given a path for science to explain perception and how the brain does it, how we indeed get that image of the external world, or the world that the little girl is looking at. So that was probably the climax of my discussion of Refuting in actuality. But let's look at a couple more of Goran's arguments. For one of his arguments is that the visual world is simply color, that color is all we are given. As he says, the inevitable conclusion must be that the presence of color is what we mean by seeing. And he says, so what's stopping a color from existing outside our experience? A color is nothing but the way it looks to us. Hardness is nothing but the way it feels to us, which, by the way, is almost the entirety of the explanation of being hit by the golf ball. We don't have to explain where the golf ball came from, why it came from, just that it feels hard. And that's all we need to know. But that's an aside. He goes on. If I remove all color from a scene, in what sense would something in it still be round? Objects are only objects insofar as they have apparent boundaries, which in the visual sense are merely colors. So we're seeing this thesis that the world is simply color and that's all we have. This insistence on there being nothing but color entirely ignores the information for form, I would note. The juncture, the discontinuity of velocity flows, as we noted, defining edges and vertices in a rotating cube. or the out-of-phase strobe disrupting the symmetry period, creating a wobbly plastic-like non-rigid knot cube from a formerly rigid rotating true cube. Or the edge velocities vectors too fast in a rotating ellipse, thereby changing things into a non-rigid wobbly ellipse, why Simoncelli and Adelson showed. Or just plain the Necker cube, simply a form, no color differential whatsoever, flipping from one form to another because the depth information is ambiguous. But this statement is critical. If I remove all color from a scene, what sense does this actually make? Where does this idea even come from? Well, IMO, this comes from the classic metaphysic, or from a confused reaction to it. The classic metaphysic we saw is an abstract space. It's an infinitely divisible space, and it's expressed ultimately as the continuum of positions. And time simply becomes another dimension of this abstract space or continuum of positions, where the fourth dimension is composed of instants. Again, points in an abstract space, instant points, also infinitely divisible. Any extent of this four-dimensional space can be infinitely divided. This four-dimensional space is entirely homogeneous. All quality has been stripped from it, both in space, that is color, sound, even form. And in time, a flow of minute instants is all you have, each present instant disappearing as the next arrives. Therefore, such a flow can have no quality. There's nothing at any instant but that instant of infinitely minute duration. Actually, a mathematical point. So what you have is a qualityless continuum. This is the classic metaphysic. So this metaphysical structure has to be working on the indirect realist frame of mind. The indirect realists were, or are, driven to hold that all color is in the mind, or color is all in the mind. Why? Well, reason one, there are no features of matter or the field of matter that directly, that is one-to-one, support color. For example, if one picks on spectral reflectance or the spectral reflectance of surfaces, one finds that there's no simple one-to-one relation of spectral reflectance to a specific color. The phenomenon of metaverse, for example, gives you different spectral reflectance distributions producing the exact same color. Then, of course, there's the complex web of similarity relations, where purple is more similar to blue than green, or red's more similar to other shades of red. And the opponent structure, red is opposed to green in the sense that no reddish shade is greenish, so too for yellow and blue. So the indirect realists were in essence driven to hold that what's out there in the external world is an uncolored, homogeneous field, whatever sense we can ultimately make of that, and that the actual color, the experience of the colored cup, the colored coffee, the colored table surface is in the brain, or in reality in the mind, because those that admit that, well, we can't really get the colored image in the brain, we don't know how that happens, are driven to saying it's in the mind, because all color must be in the mind, because again, the brain too is an uncolored, homogeneous field. So logically, color can only be in the mind, which of course is now unreachable by any science. Second reason, the classic metaphysic underlying all science and all thought on the hard problem. A homogeneous continuum has no color in the first place. But this is exactly where Goran is coming from. He just goes all the way. there is no field of matter, homogeneous or not. Yep, there's just color, and color is just idea in the mind. For Bergson, however, the indivisibly transforming holographic field is qualitative. It is a qualitative field. The perceived color is still a matter of optimal specification. It is not a simple specification, not a simple one-to-one specification. It is a complex specification. Yes, just as in form, for example, the strobe rotating cube, where there are no features, such as edges and vertices, that serve as one-to-one properties to which to map colors. There simply cannot be. There are innumerable conditions of light and shade, and yet color must be specified for ecological purposes, for survival purposes, as a constant. The rat sees the cheese, a nice yellow piece of cheese, whether in sunlight, bright sunlight, or cloudy conditions, or dark conditions, he needs to see the yellow cheese. So invariance and variance are still being isolated, specified. One can see a long discussion of this and defense of this color as invariant specification in St. Ruzicki's book, A Vision of the Brain, in 1993. Or you can see my longer discussion on this subject in Journal of Mind and Behavior and the article Time, Form, and Limits of Qualia. So all color in the mind is, again, back to my psychological hypothesis, rather a frustration from a lack of a theory of the origin of the image of the external world and the classic metaphysic which drives this failure. Now, Walt, Goran's interlocutor in the book, tries to make sense of this. Slight paraphrase in the quote below. Quote, "What comprises the objects is physical matter," he says. That in interaction with us causes some sensations to arise in us, in our apparatus for experiencing, namely the brain. They can never say brain in this book for some reason. And by the way, this very notion of visual sensations is just philosophical BS. It's just another word for the visual image. Gibson, I would note, just had a cow over that phrase, visual sensations. There are no visual sensations, other than if you poke your eye. To really put the cap on things, Goran now says, quote, all that depends on their being an independent physical space in which they exist. There's not. Remember how the idea of an external world is just that, an idea? And he goes on, the coffee mug in front of you doesn't appear in space, but it's from the directions along which it is extended that we have abstracted the concept of space. The coffee mug is space. The duality between space and things is purely conceptual. And Goran's final nail in objective reality's coffin follows. Since appearances and their extension are inseparable, we can now reveal that the only reality space has, it is merely an element of perceiving itself. And finally, virtually just before the final Tao statement, which is the last statement in the book, he notes that since space is simply a form of our experiencing, it cannot exist apart from that. Quote, for that would involve us imagining that the way in which experiencing manifests can somehow exist independently of experiencing. For Bergson, the conceptual structure of abstract space has indeed grafted itself upon our experiencing. But our actual experience is of concrete extensity. And this forces us ultimately into the true nature of the matter field. And there we're getting forced into the matter field. So no, space as concrete extensity, as Bergson called it, is not just a form of our experiencing. It is quite objective, but just more profound than realized. Even if space were just a relation between objects, that is, a posterior attribute, a relation between objects only. Nevertheless, Goran's objects are simply transferences of state in the global transformation of the matter field. Remembering Bergson's model, metaphor, the kaleidoscope, the whole is changing, and the objects and motions that we identify in the whole are merely transferences of state within the global motion of the whole. The objects are not independent objects, but the objects themselves, as part of the global whole, indeed have volume, spatial volume, as Cat can clearly see. But whence the volume? Whence the volume? Whence the volume of space? Now we would come to a way deeper understanding of the actual nature of the field, or what I keep calling the matter field, as a intuitive statement. And this is really the nature of the ether, which is now disguised under the term quantum fluid, because the QM folks don't want to admit that they're actually back to the ether. So what if, as Ken Wheeler puts it, this is the case? Space is really nothing other than the lack of the ether's inertia. Or space is created as a posterior attribute of a divergent field. So we're going to come to the actual nature of a field, which is a term and a definition thereof that really is missing in science. Believe it or not. It's as a field, as a question, something to run from. But in order to go further into this whole subject, we're going to have to wait. We'll have to put it all together. We'll have to mesh at some other point. So at this point, we're going to end our discussion of Goran and his notion of refuting the external world and go on. So we're going to move to Bernardo Kastrup and his book More Than Allegory on religious myth, truth, and belief. Now Bernardo has written, by my count, at least 7 books, Allegory being the most recent. He's a PhD in computer engineering with specializations in AI and reconfigurable computing. He's worked as a scientist in labs such as CERN and Phillips Research Laboratory. In other words, he's quite a brilliant guy. In part 2 of Allegory, he develops his arguments for a very raw idealism. Quote, I've argued that the existence of a world independent of consciousness is an inference, a hypothesis. We can never be sure it is really there. And he gives his most worrisome reason why. The latest experiments in the field of quantum mechanics have rendered all but untenable the notion that there is anything objective at all. There follows references to multiple experiments. For example, Kim and others have shown that observation not only determines the world perceived at present, but also retroactively changes it so that its history becomes consistent with what is measured now. And a group of scientists in Australia confirmed through yet another more sophisticated experiment that the universe really does not exist, except insofar as it is observed. Well, it's a good thing that he gave us some wiggle room, quote, all but untenable, unquote. I would fear that this flee to idealism is kind of a form of quantum frustration, putting on my Freudian glasses. We know the interpretation of QM is a rather confusing mess. Rather than this Copenhagen-based observation causes everything model, there are other interpretations of at least some of these findings, We have seen some of them in Ruth Kastner, for example, in part 10, also explaining some of these at least. I haven't gone into all of he had about 7 things he listed, Bernardo did. There's also Bohm's pilot wave model, which I know handles at least some of this. But likely worse, we have caught a glimpse that all of this quantum mechanics stuff is very possibly due to a basic misunderstanding of the ether, or equally, the dropping of all thought on the ether and of all progress in electromagnetism, as we noted in part 18. Bernardo sees this idealism, however, as entirely the implication of religious myth. Significantly, idealism is precisely what many of the world's religious myths have been hinting at for thousands of years. His many examples lead to this. Many examples of myth. The world we ordinarily experience is a mental creation. Its concrete form arises out of an emptiness through cognitive self-reference, a process whose inherent circularity makes you believe that you were born in the world, but it is you, through your human thinking, who is creating the whole of it now, now, and now. Creating the whole universe, the whole world now, now, and now. The now, now, and now here references his concept that there is only now, the present. There's no past, there's no flow of time, only the present instant. It sounds quite a bit like as we saw in part 20, the series of instantaneous collapses of the quantum state. I would suspect as well that each now must equally have the extent in time of a mathematical point as well. Referencing Joseph Campbell's work on myth, he notes, it reveals that when looked at closely, many of the world's religious myths suggest that the universe isn't out there, that it is instead a kind of a dream, and a personal, transpersonal cosmic mind. Now the above isn't quite the same as this in the previous quote, but it is you, through your human thinking, who is creating the whole of it now, now, and now. The latter quote, human thinking quote, seems to ascribe the creation of the entire universe to the individual. The former to cosmic being. This is a somewhat common equivocation or ambiguity in this literature, at least it seems as such. So if we take a mystical pause in the mystical framework for a moment, the individual is cosmic being, individualized. Unique perspective thereof has this power, that is to create the entire universe. One could take it this way, assuming the individual is completely identified with God or cosmic being. That is, in other words, a being of great attainment. But even the great yogi Babaji, if one reads Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi, doesn't seem to be claiming to be creating the entire universe, though clearly, as Yogananda describes it, Babaji has great powers of creation. But nevertheless, as we've already seen, even if the universe is taken as a cosmic mind, and all within as part of a cosmic dream, cosmic dreamers, the world out there for us normal dreamers is very objective. We still get hit by golf balls. We still all sink in ships and drowned in very real objective water. So the question becomes, then what is Kastrup's theory of our image of this non-existent dreamed world? Well, in part 3 of Allegory, he describes his work for and experiences with the club, quote unquote, a research effort into consciousness, being, the universe, funded by a secret group of billionaires. What has been developed in this club, in this effort by the club, is a tripart technology. It consists of a helmet with modulated electromagnetic fields, a cocktail of drugs that you get to take, and an AI program monitoring neural patterns and which modulates the EM fields and the drug mixture. All this is to achieve targeted states of, shall we say, transcendent consciousness. The target state is what Kastrup calls the dome. In this state, Kastrup converses with the other. And the other is roughly defined as the entire consciousness of the universe, excluding Kastrup's particular individual focus of this consciousness. Now, to the dome, I think I can attest. If I confess to two trips, which in my life, I find myself in one of them, in what I actually felt as the dome of being. In this dome, both I and my fellow tripper proceeded to have a rather cosmic conversation on education as purposed as proper to the evolution of consciousness. So the purpose of education is the evolution of consciousness. But these ideas arose from my companion's reading. And this is kind of the problem. The other tells Kastrup that he or she, whatever the other is, can only answer to what Kastrup asks. That is, the impetus, the subjects must come from within Kastrup. Or what you're going to get out is a function of what you can put in. But in the book, via the other's revelations, it is at least implicitly claiming to offer the solution to Chalmers' hard problem, or the origin of our image of the external world. But the story proffered by the other is no explanation of the origin of our image of the external world. The concepts are mostly captured in the few passages, direct and are paraphrased a bit. They go like this: we are collapsed segments of mind at large that wake up inside it, that is mind's dream. So we wake up inside the dream of mind. The collapse equals the compression of a vast set of ideas or beliefs. A satellite, as a metaphor here, a satellite photograph of a city gives a broad, comprehensive view from outside. But standing in the street gives a localized view from the inside. For example, the facades of the buildings, the addresses on the mailboxes. Sense perception is the view from the inside out. This view isn't available before the cognitive collapse. That is, the collapse of mind into a segment, me, or you, one of the listeners here. And he notes, my experiences could be modulated as opposed to generated by my material brain in that world. That is the world of mind or mind at large. So we'll come back to this. I truly don't know what a modulation of experience could possibly mean in Kastrup's framework. We'll come back to that. In any case, we see an idealism where all is in mind, where we are mind, individualized, unique perspectives within mind. The external world, with the coffee cup and spoon, does not exist. It is a creation of our mind. Now, again, we start to trip over the equivocation. Our mind, individual mind. Ultimately, unfortunately, whether we little minds are seen while perched atop a satellite, looking down at the city, or seen from a perch atop our tricycle in the street, we still, plain scientists, require a theory of seeing, of perception. Standard panpsychism has none, idealism has none. It has no clue how an image of the coffee cup is created. It just says it is so. So we are told that experiences can be modulated by the brain as opposed to generated by the brain. In other words, we're getting some small change thrown at a theory of perception. But what such a modulation could actually be is the question. How do I modulate my experience of a canoe trip, or my experience of coffee drinking, or my experience of driving to town? How is an experience modulated? Experience is an experience already. It's already an experience. What sense does it make to be modulated? I do not know. It sounds like just verbal word salad thrown out there for interest. With Bergson, mind at large becomes the field of matter taken as a holographic field. the vast, indivisibly transforming interference pattern. At the null scale of time, the field has elementary attributes of mind that is pure perception, as we noted. And the brain, as a reconstructive wave, is specifying a past portion of the field as an image. It's limiting, not generating this perception. The dynamics of the brain is opposing a scale of time on the specified image. Actually, scale of time upon the field, resulting in a scaled image. A buzzing fly of normal scale as opposed to a heron-like fly, slowly flapping its wings. That would be a different scale of time. The modulation, there's the word modulation, of the reconstructive wave, that is the brain's creation of a reconstructive wave, determines the experience and the form thereof. That is, the whole of field is not simply experience to be modulated. The origin of its specified scale of time requires explanation too. So if we start from the whole of field, and we've already noted, yes, it has a certain attributes of mind, it therefore could be called experience at its most elementary form, elemental, infinitely small, null scale time form. Yes, we could be saying we are saying we are modulating experience, because we've noted that subject and object is already, in essence, from the brain's point of view, a specification of experience. But in other words, Bernardo's idealism, which simply assumes our normal form of experience as idea, has the same time scale fallacy as previously noted by Goran Backlund. Again, the specification is to the past, a past transformation of the field, for the fly's perceived wing beats are long since in the past, and this is supported by the indivisibility of this time transformation. From the other, we get essentially that time as a series of nows, which would effectively be mathematical points in extent. Else he's got to develop a whole theory of where the extent of these nows come from and how the extent of these series of extended nows are still strung together to form the continuous experience of a buzzing fly or a stirring spoon. So we have seen, parts 3, 8A and 8B, the logical problems with this view of time. And we won't go into the inadequacies of the other on this subject. However, this discrete instant or now view is easy when working in idealism, for you are unconstrained by actual problems of perception. That is, you don't have to explain, as I just noted, that the perception of time extended flowing events, whether it be pouring, splashing coffee, fluttering butterflies, waving scarves. Remember, even if you have a series of nows, which, like in some of the philosophical literature that I'm threatening to expose or discuss, and temporal consciousness, if these nows have a little bit of temporal extent, you still have to show how they're strung together. You need the glue to form continuous events. And where's that glue come from? Well, that becomes the big question, unless you have Bergson's model of indivisible transforming field. So Bergson's model provides a model where indeed all is mind, that is the indivisibly transforming holographic field, yet the brain as matter, where matter is being a limiting case of mind at the null scale, and the external field of matter are equally very real. A note here, my little note here, where the limiting case came from. We discussed that in part 3. But both of these can be explored by science. That is, one can study the ecological laws, the invariance laws, as described by J.J. Gibson, defining or structuring the image. And one can study the physics employed by the brain in specifying the image that is a subset of the external field. The other, and its idealism, where there is no constraint on what mind can do, can hatch up as an idea, provides no such purchase for science. Because under idealism, where is the constraint for anything that can be? If the mind can simply hatch up things. So I've mentioned no constraints a few times. Here's an example of just how bad this can be. Here's a flat Earth model, where the Earth is conceived as a flat plane. The wavy lines are the path of the moon and sun. And so this particular model happens to work. It accounts for the motion of the sun and moon just as it would for a globe if the sun and moon simply drop over the far edge and then reappear on the other side, on the other edge, the next day. But the question is, how does this happen? How physically does the sun and the moon just drop over the edge? Where do they go? How do they come back again? What physics would be involved? Well, no problem. According to the authors of this model, for the entire Earth is a holographic projection. Well, actually an illusion or creation of the cosmic mind or of God. And the authors base this on the very same quantum implications that Bernardo invokes and which led him to the concept that all is idea, to idealism. So under this no constraints free-for-all, one would have to wonder how would anyone ever prove them wrong? But this is the difficulty with going to a pure idealism. I suspect that Kastrup's observation here in the book is significant. He notes that many famous authors, the explorers, he calls them, have been part of this club, and have been participants in these experiments and methodology. He implies this may be where they got their ideas and material. So I kind of wonder, well, I'll just say this. All of the explorers could use to explore Mr. Bergson. Unfortunately, none do. The other doesn't seem to understand the other that they're going to, or even likely know about this great philosopher. So down the road, there's a Tesla 2 in my mind, focusing on what is a field. The notion of field is kind of scary to physics. It's like, as one theorist says, showing Dracula the cross. All one has to ask, if you think about your understanding of magnetism, is ask, what do I understand about the attraction of two magnets? We know North Pole is attracted to South Pole, but that's simply a description. The question is, why? What is that attraction? Now you're in the heart of the problem of field. What are the implications when one really explores this subject, which is really, again, to go back to the ether? The implications for mind, for consciousness, and the problem of action, as we've been discussing. Then there's a deep learning subject, which I have to get to before the whole fad of deep learning disappears. There's temporal consciousness, philosophical discussion thereof, more on current memory research, which would be good, and likely something else as these things keep arising to my awareness. So next we'll see. Until then, signing off.